You're joking, right? I blinked at Karen, who stood on my porch in a glittery white dress, smug as ever. No, I'm not, she snapped. The HOA said your pool is community property, and my wedding guests are already on their way. That was the moment I decided. If she wants the pool so bad, she can have it. Just not the way she expects. Hope her guests like swimming in lime Jell-O. It started with a knock that felt more like a command. Karen stood on the front porch, hands on her hips, wearing that signature smirk that always meant trouble. Her clipboard was tucked under one arm, and she looked far too smug for someone about to make the most entitled request I'd ever heard. I'm here about the pool, she said, skipping any sort of greeting. I blinked. The what? The pool, she repeated slowly, as if I were the dull one. Your pool. I'll need it on the 12th, afternoon to evening. I stared, waiting for the punchline. She didn't laugh. Instead, she glanced at her clipboard and started flipping through papers. The community center's pool is undergoing maintenance. Apparently someone ignored the pH balance and now the water's basically bleach. So we need a replacement venue. And you picked my backyard? Well, yes. She gave me a condescending shrug. You're centrally located, your landscaping is tasteful, and your pool is visible from the street, which makes it technically part of the neighborhood aesthetic. I nearly choked. You're telling me my private pool is fair game because people can see it from the road? Karen nodded. It's not just me. The board agrees. Your property is part of the HOA's Visual Cohesion Plan. Page 37 of the guidelines. Visibility implies shared value. It's all very standard. Standard? I scoffed. That doesn't even make sense. Karen gave a tight-lipped smile, clearly enjoying the power trip. Look, I get it. You're not used to hosting, but this isn't just any party, it's my wedding. And honestly, it would reflect poorly on you if you refused to participate. The neighborhood is watching. I'm not part of the wedding, I said flatly. You live here. That makes you part of the community. Her voice turned syrupy. It's a small thing. Just a few guests. Family, close friends. Maybe 40 or 50 people. My jaw dropped. 50? She waved her hand dismissively. They won't all be in the pool at once. Besides, I've already arranged for a DJ to set up near your fence line, and I told the caterer to park in your driveway. You did what? She paused, clearly annoyed that I wasn't falling in line. Don't be difficult. You're acting like this is a big ask when really it's just a neighborly gesture. I'm not offering a gesture. I'm protecting my property. Karen narrowed her eyes. Fine. Then maybe the board will need to vote on it. There's a clause about community events and reasonable access. We've used it before, and I'm confident the outcome will be in my favor. You're threatening to force your way into my backyard? I asked, stunned. I'm suggesting we handle this democratically, she said smoothly. If you won't cooperate voluntarily, we can take it to the board. They're meeting tomorrow night. Before I could even respond, she turned and strutted down my walkway like she'd already won. I stood there, stunned, trying to process the sheer absurdity of what had just happened. Use my pool? For a wedding? Because it's visible? Later that evening, I took a walk around the neighborhood, still too irritated to sit still. I half expected to hear gossip or whispers, but what I saw instead stopped me cold. Stapled to the neighborhood bulletin board, right next to the dog walking schedule and the bake sale flyer, was a brand new announcement. Join us in celebrating Karen and Todd's wedding. Date, Saturday, the 12th time, 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. Location, community pool, hosted at 127 Willow Creek Drive. That was my address. My blood ran cold. Not only had she decided my pool was fair game, she'd already started advertising it like it was official. No mention of asking, no pending approval, just bold, printed certainty. Neighbors passed by and smiled, completely unaware that the location hadn't been approved by anyone but Karen and her clipboard. One of them even patted me on the shoulder and said, "Thanks for being such a good sport. It's going to be a beautiful ceremony." I didn't respond. Inside, I tore the flyer down and read it again. The arrogance, the assumption, the absolute disregard for personal boundaries. She hadn't asked for permission, she'd asked to inform, and the decision was already made in her mind. The pool wasn't mine anymore. It was a prop in her perfect wedding fantasy. That's when I realized something. If Karen thought my pool was going to be the centerpiece of her big day, maybe it still could be, just not the way she imagined. Karen wasn't the type to take no for an answer. The next day, the HOA complaint hit my mailbox, a formal letter printed in crisp, authoritative font, accusing me of refusing access to communal amenities and hindering a neighborhood event. The letter claimed the pool wasn't solely private. Since it was visible from the street and benefited the entire community, it was now part of the shared neighborhood assets. A complete fabrication. But the kicker was the demand. I was expected to make my pool available for Karen's wedding on the 12th, or face a fine. The letter hinted that if I didn't comply, I could be held liable for preventing positive community engagement. Karen, of course, had already made it clear that this was no request. It was a demand dressed up as a courtesy. I took a breath, but only so I could stop myself from putting my fist through the letterbox. Instead, I shoved it into my desk drawer, choosing to sit on the anger rather than react right away. Karen had crossed a line, but I needed to bide my time. The next few days were a blur of questions from neighbors. It started small. One or two people stopping by, curious about the wedding. But it quickly escalated. By midweek, everyone had heard about it. They all asked the same thing. How cool is it that your pool's the wedding venue? At first, I laughed it off, deflecting with some half-hearted excuse about how I wasn't sure. But the questions kept coming. People wanted details, wanted to know if I was going to serve drinks or if there would be a live band. They treated it like a done deal. And Karen wasn't helping. One afternoon, she knocked on my door with an agenda that was somehow both overbearing and condescending. In her hands was a printed schedule for the wedding day. Ceremony at 4 p.m., cocktail hour at 5:30, dinner at 7, and dancing until 10. Along with it was a neatly typed list of over 40 guests she had already invited, detailing who would be using the pool at what time. I scanned the list in disbelief, eyes landing on the names of people I didn't even know. Neighbors from the block I hadn't seen in years, plus a few people from her side of the family who I was fairly sure didn't live anywhere near here. The schedule's finalized, she said, trying to sound casual. And the guests are excited. We're all set for the big day. I felt a sharp pang of frustration. All set, she said. It was as if this entire event had been planned without even a shred of consideration for me. My property, my privacy. None of it mattered to her. I handed the list back without a word, forcing myself not to snap. Instead, I focused on the sheer arrogance of it. She expected me to just roll over and let this happen because of some HOA rule book she'd clearly twisted to her benefit. I'll think about it, I said, as diplomatically as I could manage, even though every fiber of my being screamed no, but that wasn't the end of it. Later that week, the HOA board weighed in with their own passive-aggressive letter. It was a masterpiece of condescension, opening with phrases like, "We trust you'll support this community-building event," and, "As a valued member of the HOA, your participation is encouraged." They didn't even attempt to mask the tone. It was clear that they were using guilt and pressure, trying to paint me as the bad guy for even considering refusing Karen. The letter concluded with a thinly veiled threat. "We hope you'll come to a decision that reflects the cooperative spirit of the neighborhood." I folded the letter carefully, placing it on my kitchen counter. The HOA wasn't just in Karen's corner. They were actively pushing me into a corner of my own. It was a warning, plain and simple, and it was a threat I wasn't going to ignore. By then, I knew one thing. I couldn't just sit back and let this happen. This wasn't just about a wedding. It was about boundaries, respect, and being pushed into a corner by people who thought they had the right to dictate every aspect of my life. I wasn't going to fight Karen and the HOA by shouting or showing anger. That wasn't my style. No, I was going to be smarter than that. I was going to strike when she least expected it. Quietly, I started making my plans. I needed a way to turn the tables, to make Karen's wedding day an unforgettable event, not in the way she expected, but in a way that made her regret ever trying to pull this stunt. I began by researching pool maintenance. How long did it take to pump out water? How much did it cost to fill a pool with something unconventional? I was determined to make sure that if Karen thought she was getting a luxury pool experience, she'd quickly discover she was wrong. My next move was a trip to the local party store. I loaded up on enough industrial-sized gelatin packets to fill my pool to the brim. Green Jello, lime flavor. It wasn't just about the pool being filled. It was about sending a clear message. No one was going to step foot in my backyard without getting a taste of what it truly meant to mess with me. By the time I had everything in place, I was calm, focused, ready to see Karen's smug face when her carefully laid plans turned into nothing more than a sticky, slippery disaster. This wasn't just about protecting my space. It was about making sure the HOA learned a lesson too. No one could dictate my life. Not Karen, not the board, and certainly not anyone who thought they could use me as a backdrop for their perfect wedding fantasy. The Jell-O plan was simple, yet brilliant, and it would be the perfect revenge. The moment I decided I was going to do this, I knew it had to be perfect. Karen's sense of entitlement had pushed me to my limits, and now I was going to show her just how far I was willing to go to protect my property. There was no turning back. I wasn't just going to mess with her wedding. I was going to make sure she'd never forget what it felt like to try and steal from someone else. The first step was preparation. I needed the right materials, and I needed them in bulk. A quick search online gave me exactly what I was looking for: industrial-sized packets of gelatin, enough to fill my pool with something so absurd that no one would ever forget it. The beauty of Jell-O was its versatility. It could be both solid and liquid depending on the temperature, and it was cheap. But it wasn't just about filling the pool with a gelatinous mess. It was about creating an experience, something that would be impossible to ignore. I placed an order for hundreds of pounds of lime-flavored gelatin powder. A few days later, it arrived in large boxes, each one heavy enough to make me question just how much I'd gotten myself into. But the quantity didn't faze me. It only fueled my determination. This wasn't just a prank. It was a statement. I was going to take back control. Next, I rented a giant commercial heater. I wasn't about to try and heat up 100 gallons of water with a cheap space heater. No, I needed something that could quickly dissolve the gelatin and ensure the mixture would be perfectly smooth before it hit the pool. This wasn't about creating some amateur mess. It had to be precise. The goal was to turn that pool into a green, wobbly monstrosity that no one could ignore. The night before the big event, I stayed up late, pacing around the backyard, testing the heater, and making sure the water was at the right temperature. I had already turned off the pool filters to avoid clogging the system with gelatin, and I wasn't planning to use the usual pool cleaning methods. I had a much more creative solution in mind. The logistics of this were critical, and every detail had to be executed flawlessly. I even enlisted the help of an old friend from college, someone who had spent his career working in event sabotage. He'd helped pull off a few pranks in his time, but this one, he assured me, would go down as one of the best. He had experience with large-scale practical effects, and while he was all for the chaos, he was also a perfectionist. Together we mapped out the timing, figuring out exactly how much gelatin we would need and how to pump it into the pool. He brought his own equipment: pipes, pumps, and even a filtration system that would make sure the gelatin wouldn't block any critical parts of the pool setup. It wasn't going to be just Jell-O sitting on top of the water. It was going to mix in and settle in the most perfect way possible. By the time everything was set up, it was well past midnight. The Jell-O was dissolved, the pumps were primed, and the pool was ready. All that was left was to start pumping the gelatin into the pool before the sun came up. We worked silently, moving like shadows in the dark, feeding the gelatin into the system while carefully monitoring the temperature to keep it smooth and flowing. It was a delicate process. One mistake, and the entire plan could fall apart. But we were in sync, working like a well-oiled machine, making sure the gelatin spread evenly across the entire surface. As the hours passed, the pool began to take shape. The water, once a calm blue, transformed into a glowing green mass that shimmered under the dim lights. The smell of lime Jell-O filled the air, thick and unmistakable. It was mesmerizing to watch it all come together, but at the same time, I could feel the weight of the moment. This was it, the perfect revenge. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep across the horizon, I stood there, staring at my work. My pool wasn't blue anymore. It was bright green and wobbled slightly, like a living creature, waiting for the first unlucky person to step into it. The transformation was complete. The Jell-O had fully set, and what had once been a quiet, pristine backyard pool was now an unrecognizable, sticky, and completely absurd landscape. I stood there for a moment, allowing the sheer ridiculousness of it all to sink in. The sight of the pool filled me with a strange sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my space, my property, and my peace of mind. Karen had wanted to use my pool for her wedding. She had assumed she could bully me into submission because of some HOA rulebook that nobody had ever read. But now, she was going to get exactly what she deserved. The sun was rising, and the first of Karen's wedding guests would be arriving soon. I could already picture the looks of confusion and disgust as they approached the pool. I could already hear Karen's voice, shrill and panicked, as she realized what had happened. The wedding she had dreamed of, the perfect event she had planned down to the smallest detail, was about to be overshadowed by something so ridiculous, so unexpected, that no one would be able to take her seriously again. But that was the point. This wasn't just a prank. It was a lesson. As I turned to head inside and watch the chaos unfold from the safety of my living room, I couldn't help but smile. The HOA had pushed me too far, and Karen had thought she could get away with everything. But by sunrise, my pool wasn't blue anymore. It was bright green and jiggled. The morning of the wedding arrived with an air of quiet anticipation that quickly turned to chaos. Karen's guests began trickling in, dressed in their finest, ready to celebrate what they assumed would be a sophisticated, upscale event. Heels clicked on the sidewalk, and tuxedoed men adjusted their bow ties as they approached the pool, each one unsuspecting of the absurd spectacle awaiting them. At first, the confusion was palpable. The first guest to notice the pool was a middle-aged woman, sharply dressed in a floral dress, her heels clicking against the stone patio as she approached the water's edge. She took one look at the green, wobbly surface and stopped dead in her tracks. Her face contorted, then softened in disbelief, as though she was trying to convince herself she hadn't just seen what was plainly in front of her. Before anyone could say a word, Karen burst out from the front door. She was already in a full-blown panic, face flushed with the combination of stress and disbelief. Her hands flew to her hips, her voice rising in a shrill scream that echoed across the yard. "This is not what we agreed on," she yelled, glaring at me from across the yard, the chaos unfolding behind her as guests began to point and murmur among themselves. "You ruined everything! You... I watched her from a distance, taking in the meltdown unfolding before me with a calm I had never thought possible. It was almost too easy to let her spiral, knowing that she had pushed me to this point. Her expectations were clearly shattered, and in the back of my mind, I could already hear her fuming as she tried to figure out who was to blame. "I didn't ruin anything, Karen," I said, my voice cutting through her hysteria. "I'm just following the same rules you gave me." She froze. What she didn't know was that I'd already anticipated her response, and I had all the evidence to back it up. With a single motion, I pulled out my phone and opened the security footage. I wasn't about to let her paint me as the villain in front of all these people. I swiped through the footage of her knocking on my door and dropping off HOA flyers, demanding that I comply with her wedding pool request and, most importantly, her smugly handing me the list of guests she'd already invited. I tapped on a specific clip, showing her glaring at the camera as she made it clear she was expecting a luxury pool experience, not some gelatinous mess. "Here's where you ask me to make it happen," I said, pressing play. The footage was crystal clear, showing Karen's every word, every move. "And here's where I agreed to allow use of the pool. I never promised it would be water." Karen's eyes widened in horror as she watched the footage. She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could say anything, one of her guests let out a loud yelp. The woman who had been closest to the pool, the one dressed in the floral dress, had taken a misstep and slipped right into the Jell-O. Her heels were no match for the slippery surface, and she went down hard, face first into the green goo. Laughter erupted from the other guests as she sputtered and tried to pull herself free, only to find her shoes completely stuck in the thick, jiggly mess. A few others ventured closer to the pool, hesitant at first, but then, one by one, stepping forward to inspect the spectacle. One man, dressed in a well-tailored suit, decided to take the plunge and test it out. Maybe he thought it was a quirky feature, something that would be fun for a laugh. But the second he tried to swim, he sank in deeper, unable to move. His legs flailed as he tried to push off the bottom, but the gelatin trapped him, and all he managed to do was splutter and gasp for air as the mess clung to him like a heavy, sticky blanket. It only took a few more moments before the first calls went out to the authorities. Karen, now beside herself, ran to the front gate and began shouting at her guests to call the police. The scene was complete chaos. Guests had started filming, some of them laughing uncontrollably, while others seemed unsure whether they should stay or leave. But this time, Karen's usual "I'm in charge" attitude wasn't going to work. When the police arrived, I stayed calm. The officer approached me with a raised eyebrow, looking at the situation with clear confusion. "What's going on here?" the officer asked, surveying the gelatinous pool and the chaos it had caused. I gave him a nod, maintaining my composure. "I'm glad you're here," I said. "I've been dealing with some very specific requests from Karen and the HOA. If you'd like, I can show you the exact conversation we had." I pulled out my phone once more, flipping through the text messages and HOA letters that had been sent to me. Everything was documented. Nothing was left to chance. I explained calmly that I hadn't refused use of the pool. I just didn't promise it would be filled with water. In fact, I had never made any promises at all about the condition it would be in. The officer, who'd obviously seen his fair share of strange incidents, nodded slowly. "Well, I don't see any reason to get involved here. Sounds like a civil matter between you two." Karen was sputtering, trying to interrupt, but the officer was already walking away, clearly done with her antics. The guests, many of them filming, were now openly laughing, and Karen's face turned a deep shade of crimson. The HOA board members, who had been standing awkwardly off to the side, were now fully exposed. They had come to support Karen, but now they looked ridiculous. No one took them seriously anymore. One by one, they shuffled away, trying to avoid the growing crowd of neighbors who were finding the entire situation hilarious. The videos that started circulating online were the icing on the cake. Neighbors had already begun sharing footage of the pool disaster, and soon, Karen's wedding went viral. Clips of guests slipping and floundering in the Jell-O were being shared by everyone from local news stations to social media influencers. The HOA's reputation was in tatters, and Karen's dream wedding was nothing more than an online joke. In the end, Karen got exactly what she deserved. She thought she could bully me into submission, but she ended up as the punchline of a viral joke. The HOA, humiliated by their association with the debacle, lost all credibility. As for me, I walked away with my pride intact, knowing that sometimes the best revenge is simply outwitting those who think they can control you. The fallout from the wedding disaster was swift and unforgiving. The videos of Karen's guests slipping and struggling in the green Jell-O pool had gone viral almost immediately, and by the next morning, the story was the talk of the neighborhood and beyond. Social media exploded with memes and hashtags, and local news stations were covering the bizarre incident as if it were the highlight of the week. What had started as a seemingly minor dispute over a pool use request had transformed into a full-blown spectacle. Karen, once the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, had been reduced to the laughingstock of the community. The repercussions for Karen weren't limited to just the wedding. The HOA, which had supported her in every demand she'd made, quickly found itself in a public relations nightmare. Neighbors, many of whom had quietly tolerated the HOA's overreach for years, now saw it for what it truly was, an organization that existed only to control and bully residents. They were furious, and they didn't stay silent. A group of homeowners banded together to file a lawsuit against the HOA for misrepresentation. They argued that the association had been abusing its power, making vague and overreaching rules, and using Karen as their unofficial enforcer. What had happened to me was only the tip of the iceberg. Others had stories of unjust fines and unexplained restrictions, all for things as trivial as a garden gnome in the wrong spot or a mailbox that didn't conform to the aesthetic standards. But it was Karen's pool debacle that had finally pushed people to take action. They demanded accountability, and they weren't going to back down. Within weeks, the HOA board was in disarray. The lawsuit took a toll, and the pressure was too much for the current leadership to withstand. Neighbors rallied behind the cause, demanding change, and new elections were called to replace the board. Karen, once the golden girl of the HOA, was swiftly voted out of her position. She had been the face of the HOA's most controversial decisions, and no one was willing to let her slide anymore. The vote was decisive. Karen had no supporters left. The position she had worked so hard to hold on to had slipped through her fingers like the gelatin in my pool. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. In the wake of the public outcry, the HOA was forced to address the fundamental issues with its rules. The governing documents, once vague and open to interpretation, were rewritten with a clear, explicit definition of what constituted pool ownership, and more importantly, the boundaries of privacy for all residents. The rules now included clear guidelines on how communal spaces could be used, with a strict requirement that any event that involved private property must be approved by all parties involved. It was a major step forward in the battle for homeowners' rights. The HOA had been forced to make real, concrete changes, something no one had anticipated when this all started. As for me, I became an unlikely local legend. In the weeks that followed, neighbors would stop by my house laughing and giving me high fives, thanking me for taking a stand against the overbearing HOA. What had started as a personal vendetta had turned into a victory for the whole neighborhood. I wasn't just the guy who had filled his pool with Jell-O. I was the guy who had stood up to the HOA and won. People would tell their kids the story of how I had outsmarted Karen, and my name was synonymous with defiance against a system that had too long taken advantage of its residents. Karen, on the other hand, became a cautionary tale. She tried to salvage her reputation by posting on social media, insisting that the whole thing had been a misunderstanding and that she was the real victim in all of this. But no one was buying it. The viral videos had cemented her as the embodiment of HOA tyranny, and no amount of spin could undo the damage. Her credibility was shattered, and she had to retreat from public life. The wedding, which she had hoped would mark the beginning of a new chapter, instead became a defining moment of embarrassment and regret. The neighborhood, however, began to heal. The HOA was no longer the omnipotent force it once had been. Neighbors had stood up, fought back, and won. With the new rules in place, the community was able to regain some sense of control over their own lives. What had started as a personal battle had turned into a larger movement, and it was clear that things were never going to be the same again. I watched all of this unfold with a quiet satisfaction, knowing that I had played a pivotal role in the transformation. As I looked out at my backyard, now free from any HOA oversight, I couldn't help but smile. The pool was still a mess of green gelatin, but it was no longer a symbol of revenge. It was a symbol of triumph. And as I walked into the store one afternoon, a neighbor called out to me from across the aisle. "Hey, you're the guy with the Jell-O pool, right?" I gave a knowing nod, and he chuckled. "You really showed her, didn't you?" I smirked and said, "Next time you RSVP to a pool party, maybe ask what's in the pool first." That was it. A perfect mic drop moment that summed up everything. In the end, it wasn't just about the pool or the Jell-O. It was about sending a message that we didn't have to accept the status quo. We could fight back. And sometimes, when you least expect it, even the most absurd ideas can lead to the greatest victories. If you enjoyed this wild ride and want to see more outrageous HOA stories unfold, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the growing community here at the HOA Stories. We're just getting started. More shocking, jaw-dropping tales of HOA madness are on the way, and you don't want to miss a single one. Like, comment, and share if you think Karen got what she deserved. And remember, the HOA might think they hold all the cards, but together, we can flip the script. Stay tuned for more, only here on the HOA Stories.